His presentation is called Weeding as Social Justice.
All right, so anyway, I would like to first begin with, this is the notion of weeding as a social justice project. And what does that exactly mean? Now, there's a lot of different ways that libraries can be involved in social justice in the communities. I work on a college campus, and usually on college campuses, we have students and student organizations that are in the forefront of these movements. And also in the larger communities as well. If you're working in a public library, you'll have various organizations that can work on any number of social justice initiatives, anything from environmental justice to voting rights. And generally, the role of libraries is kind of limited in here. I know a lot of libraries, they have collection development goals to include more diverse voices and subject matter. And they're also using meeting space to host community groups and discussions. On college campuses, at least Columbia-Greene, we're trying to do something called open educational resources. And what that is an effort to lower the cost of textbooks. A lot of these are being published through a SUNY initiative, and it's usually SUNY faculty who are actually writing them or co-authoring them. And in a lot of cases, these books could cost, say, they're less than $100, whereas some biology textbooks could go for $300 or more. So on our campus, that's viewed as a social justice issue. However, even then, there is more that can be done. And weeding is that role. Now, you may not realize it, but lurking in your stacks, you can have books with stereotypical imagery, titles that use outdated language, or they could promote discredited theories that are directed at racial or sexual minorities. And there's a couple ways that you can find these titles. One of them is by using certain search terms in your OPAC. But the way, otherwise, you might just have to go into the stacks and go title by title. That doesn't mean you necessarily go your entire stacks. You maybe just go into certain sections. And that's some of the things that we'll talk about today. Now, one thing I want to caution about is just because some titles may contain outdated language, it does not mean that you automatically remove them. This is not, say, cancel culture, if you will. Okay, because in some academic disciplines, such language was the norm, and it may adorn classic titles. So everything really needs to be done on a case-by-case basis. And as librarians, we do have a professional obligation to take into account things like prejudice, racism, and stereotypical portrayals when we're deciding whether or not to retain a book in our collection. So this project at Columbia-Greene actually had some pretty humble origins. Last summer, we were scheduled to receive new carpeting in our second floor, which is where our book stacks were. And after that project was done, the collection, we needed to be sure that this crew put everything back properly, in proper order. And as it was, we were facing a severe space crunch with our collections. Sometimes just to put a new book on the shelf, we had to go up there and just do some immediate spot weeding in certain sections. So it just needed to be weeded anyway. And this was one thing where the pandemic actually helped, because almost all of our classes were remote. We had hardly anybody in the facility. So I was able to devote a lot of time to actually going into the stacks and pulling items. And so what happened was, as I was starting along, I started moving into a subject called the World History, which is Library of Congress, call number D. I started noticing some older titles that really had some questionable cover imagery, or there was some wording in the titles and subtitles that I found were kind of problematic. One example, there was a book about Africa that had an image of a spear on there. Now, some of our younger participants may not know, but there was some racist terminology revolving around that. So I ended up removing the title. What actually helped in that regard was that the title hadn't gone out in 40 years. So I'm going to do a few words of warning here in advance. The following slides may contain material that some of you might find offensive. I am not doing so to offend. My goal here is to hopefully inspire each of you to go into your collections and try and find these kind of materials if you have them, and consider removing them. Because if we do so, it's a step toward greater acceptance of all people. All right, now I do have a list of books that were removed from the college library that had this material. It turned out it wasn't really a huge number. I think I have probably 40 titles on that sheet. That's before I actually, some of these were removed before I actually began working on this presentation. So it wasn't really that many. So what is problematic? Outdated language, obviously. Cover imagery that can be construed as having negative stereotypes. And also older titles that by today's standards imply that someone cannot do something. I can remember several years ago, I found a title in our automotive collection. It was, auto repair for women, and the cover imagery was pretty bad, and it was actually written in a very condescending tone. I showed it to some of my student workers, and they cringed. It's like, and my attitude was, thank you, that's all I needed to know. This cover imagery here, this was a book that I found problematic with the cover imagery. I've traveled in Mexico. I don't know if any of you have, but I'm going to be honest. I never saw anybody wearing a sombrero down there. They dressed just like we did. And so I kind of removed that. It did help that that book hadn't gone out since, I think, the 1980s. So how is weeding social justice? You can remove titles that imply male or white supremacy. You can remove titles with cover imagery that can be considered insensitive and racist, like the one on this page. That was almost an immediate decision right there, just to pull that particular title. The content of the book itself was actually written by, you don't actually see it here in the image, but there were essays by Asian Americans. However, if we want to have a book about a historical experience of Asian Americans, we owe it to our readers to have something that's more current. This particular book is actually from the early 1970s. And so that's another reason why that was removed. This image just really repulsed me. And also too, you can remove titles where the terminology is considered offensive or outdated. The way I like to view it is, imagine if we did have an Asian American student who went into the stacks and pulled this book out. How would they feel? We can talk all we want about trying to include diverse voices and buying these new titles by diverse authors or different underrepresented groups, but all it takes is one thing like this, and your efforts are basically for naught. This is what they're gonna remember, not all the other efforts. So really the best way to find books with these problematic cover imagery is to go through the stacks. And it's most likely older titles that are going to have such imagery. And also too, you might find, if you take a look at the circulation numbers, they probably haven't gone out in a long time. So you could justifiably weed them. Now, Columbia-Greene, we have a pretty large criminal justice program. And, our students deserve the most current work that's available and out there. And this particular title is from the early 1970s. This cover image, I didn't like it because I just didn't like the implication that all the prison population is African American, and there was just something pretty ominous about the drawing of the white inmate behind him. The whole thing just struck me as actually very disturbing. So that's why I was able to pull that and get rid of it. We had so many newer titles in that area that we were able to be just fine with more current material. So what do I mean by male supremacy? That I'm using it in the context of the term refers to titles that use man as an encompassing term for people and humanity. And you can find examples throughout an academic library collection and probably within a public library's nonfiction collections. Like take this title, Solar Energy for Man. My initial response is, ladies, you get fossil fuels. All humor aside, though, it's not an inclusive word. However, there's a caveat with this. Just because a title uses man as an all-encompassing term does not mean you should automatically remove it. In the subject area of anthropology, there are a lot of works, and there are probably classics in the field that use terms like man as a general term for humanity, such as this title here, The Quest for Man. Now, in the case of Columbia-Greene, I needed to make some space, and I also found out we hadn't had an anthropology class on our campus in 30 years. So I was just able to blanketly remove this entire collection because these books just hadn't gone out since the last anthropology class. Now, in the following slides, I'll show you some examples of how common this was. Mirror for Man, the relation of anthropology to modern life, and this geography of man, where at least they're getting some, different representations of, what humanity looks like. And these might be classic titles in anthropology. So if you're working at a college that has a program or classes in this, you might not want to blanketly remove these titles. However, you can find titles that use the word man in pretty much any subject area. This one on the left, Man and Movement, Principles of Physical Education. I find it kind of amusing because here you have a representation of a male and a female, but it's Man and Movement. This particular title was actually published in 1988, which is surprisingly recent. The Music of Man, I don't remember when that one was published, but this one on the right, The Congressman, His Work as He Sees It, that was published in around the late 60s. And even though the number of women in Congress at that time had been very few, there had been some, and it wouldn't be long after that there would be more. So, again, that's not being very inclusive with the titles. Good works in their day, and also that was common language in the 1960s, 1970s, and obviously it continued into the 80s. But we don't talk, that's really, we've moved away from that. So to find these titles, you can search your OPAC. They don't just include the word man, but you can use terms like businessman, policeman, fireman, so on and so forth. So that's one way you can find a lot of these titles. Now, another thing though is, this one I found just going through the stacks, if you stumble across a title that credits a female writer or a contributor as a Mrs. rather than using her actual name, I would consider removing the title. Over here on this particular, the image on the screen here, volunteerism, with a foreword by Mrs. George Romney. My first reaction was, what, she doesn't have a name of her own? But for our younger participants today, that was actually, referring to women that way was very common. At the Columbia-Greene Library, we have a collection on microfilm of the Hudson newspaper going back into the mid-19th century. And when I'm looking up obituaries for people from the 1970s, I come across this a lot, where a woman who has passed is referred to strictly by her married name. They don't list her actual first name or her maiden name, nothing like that. So it was apparently very common back then, but we don't do that anymore, thankfully. Another thing that you could find in your stacks are homophobia. And even though most, or if not all, libraries are making an effort to be more inclusive and buy more diverse titles, you still might have items in there in which they have there's homophobia in there, and they might not be apparent necessarily by just glancing at the title. You're going to have to take a closer look at them. And sometimes I found a couple of titles in our collection that actually endorsed conversion therapy for LGBTQ people, and that theory has been discredited. Now, in the case of this title, Overcoming Sexuality, on the dust jacket, it says, homosexuals are made, not born, in quotation marks, that way. You can look up here, he's saying it's a psychological disorder that can be treated and overcome. Now, keep in mind, this book was published in 1980. Right around the time at the time there was a big cultural shift that was starting to happen in this country. We were really moving more into a conservative era. And so it reflects that time. And incidentally, there are still 5 SUNY schools that have this particular title. Now, others titles make their homophobia very explicit. And this one I found in our military section. This is from 1993, and the case against homosexuals in the military. And this one was just really offensive, and it was just immediate decision to pull it. Fortunately, no other SUNY schools had it. And if you look at the image here of the back, it's on the right side, talking about it poses a serious danger of AIDS and other diseases, increasing the danger of pedophilia. And I'm just going to stop right there. If you're reading it, you get the sense of just how bad this particular title is. So to find these titles, these were located I found these by going into the LGBTQ and the military sections and basically going book by book. For those of you in a college library who are, use Library of Congress classification, you would find those in HQ in the social sciences, and also U, that's military. Another way that you can probably find these titles is you can use your OPAC and do a Boolean search for homosexuality, and then on a second line, you'd have to do an advanced search, use psychological aspects. And the admittedly very few titles that I found, I think I found a total of 3 that really fit the title of homophobic. They're in that spreadsheet that I mentioned that is going to be available to every one of you. Now, another problem term is what's now called the R word. And at one time, it was actually an accepted medical term. It was very common. However, nowadays, the term intellectual disability is more accurate and considered far more acceptable. In our case, removing these titles, it reflected our desire to keep up with changing language uses, and again, our desire to create an inclusive environment. Now, another caveat with this is you might find in your collection evaluation that some books that have that word in the title or subtitle probably should be retained. In some cases, they might talk about the social lives of those individuals. They might also be histories of the condition. And so again, you can, just because a book has that word in the title, it should not be just blanketly removed. You need to take a closer look at it. However, there are some where you might find that, yeah, maybe the content is good, but you have newer, more current information, and we should always strive to have the most current information available. Now, let's say you're a parent and you have a child with an intellectual disability, and you go into the library and you see either of these titles that are on the screen. How are you going to feel? What are you going to think about that library that you're patronizing? The one on the left, the far left, is the worst. That was, it was in support of mainstreaming in public schools, but we had newer material that did not have that offensive of a title, thankfully. So just a reminder that I do have an Excel spreadsheet of the titles that we removed, and you're welcome to email me at john.santana@sunycgcc.edu. I will get that to you next week. I'm actually off today. I have some kids here. You might be able to see. I don't know if you probably can't see any of them in the background. But I will get that to you next week, and you can use that as a starting point for any projects that you might do in this capacity. And with that, I'd open up the floor to any questions.
This is great. Thank you, John. While people are, formulating questions, typing them in, it also might be a good time to promote we have a collection development SIG. I'm just going to drop the link in the chat. That's coming up on May 5th. You are all welcome to register for that if you want. And we'll be talking about this kind of thing, talking about weeding and, refining our collection. So that might be to continue that conversation. You're all welcome to join that. And I see Gina has a hand raised, so I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, John. This is Gina at Mount St. Mary College. I have
Hi.
two questions. One, I was wondering when you were going through this process, if you had heard of any libraries that retain material for historical purposes and maybe use a label or some way of describing, sort of acknowledging that there might be outdated language or imagery, but the reason why the item was retained.
I did not. However, at Columbia-Greene, what we do for those kind of cases is we just have a simple sticker. We just put on there and it says historical. That's really about it. Our situation is a little bit different. You could be at a library that might have the ability to retain those kind of materials. We are in such a severe space crunch that we just needed to make room. Okay. It was just that bad. And so our decisions were often made a little bit easier. In some cases, we might have found that something was the last title in SUNY and we may have kept it. However, in the case of that Gays in the Military book, there was no way I was going to keep that. I thought it was a pretty easy defensible position.
Yeah, it sounds like this process requires a lot of sensitivity and a humble look at the materials and the messages you're sending. I was wondering if you had any resources you could suggest to me or the audience about sort of literature in the library field that talks about how to go about this process.
A couple sources that I used are they're in the slide presentation. They're at the end there. There's just a couple additional sources. One of them was actually pertaining to the recent move by Dr. Seuss's estate to stop publishing 6 of those titles. And the other one was a blog post from Boston University regarding intellectual disabilities. Mm-hmm. So that's what and actually regarding those Dr. Seuss books, we actually had 2 of them in our kids' collection. And, we have a daycare that comes in every week. And after discussing that and actually discussing it with a couple of faculty members who teach education, what we decided to do is we pulled those titles out of the circulating collection and we put them in the course reserves for those particular courses, because the teachers and professors want to use those to show their students and say, now imagine, you're an African-American child and you see this imagery here in a Dr. Seuss book, and we bought a zoo. How is that going? So they're trying to use it as a tool to teach empathy. So, and a lot. So that's one option that you have. But in other cases, though, a lot of our faculty were just, they were just like, go ahead and get rid of it. We trust your judgment. And so that's what we were able to do. And like I said, the amount of titles that I have on the spreadsheet, it's not large. It's maybe just, I think it's like 40 titles. I mean, there's some more, but again, and I'm a little more than halfway through the collection at this point. So.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you. I also see a question here in the chat from Adriana Martinez. It reads, "Hey, John, thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering if you have considered teaching students about this kind of process in libraries." That's an excellent question. I have not. If it comes up with some of the faculty, like regarding the Dr. Seuss books, I certainly could. I would definitely be open to that. But I don't really see an outlet in my job, teaching library skills, mentioning about that. It would probably be a good thing for professors at library colleges to talk about. But thank you for the question, Adriana. That's an excellent question.
And John, I don't know if you saw just above that, Marla Gruner also had a question.
Oh, okay. Oh, here we are. Okay. In reference to removing the title where women are referred to by their married names, do you think that could have a negative impact on representation of women in the collection? I think so. I think it shows them as subservient to men necessarily. Again, it's in that case, it's just outdated. When that book was published, that was common practice then, and like I mentioned earlier, it was the common practice for obituaries in our local newspaper during the 1970s and 60s. But I kind of think it is. I think I think if a female student saw that book and saw that cover, they might get a nice chuckle out of it, maybe, but they may not express to you what they're feeling inside. And in this case, I really want to try and err on the side of caution. That said, again, you have to take this on a case-by-case basis. Another problematic word is Eskimo. That's actually, more of a white word. The preferred term is Inuit. And I got into a section where it had, we had a book on Eskimo art. That was the title. Right next to it was a title called Inuit art. That was an easy decision to make. So, I just went ahead and removed that. However, we did find several other titles that had Eskimo in there, and they were actually looks at the culture and the lives of the Inuit people. So I didn't get rid of those. And again, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Marla just types in, my concern is that we're removing women's scholarship. Let me just expand on that a little bit more, Marla. If the author of a title is billed as Mrs. So-and-so, you might want to keep that. I haven't encountered that, but that is an option. In the case of the book I showed, it was the introduction that was written by George Romney's wife. Anything else? Any other questions?
No, I think we addressed them all, and we're coming in right at time. So
Fabulous.
great. Thanks, John. So